Hello, welcome to the review for the second midterm exam. Um, First of all, most of the videos that we have been watching have been recorded far earlier. This one is being recorded this week, and I do want to commend everybody on sticking with your studies despite the negative news. If anybody needs my assistance with anything and figuring out your next steps, please drop me a line and I will be happy to help you in whatever way that I can. But for now, today is going to be the review for the second midterm exam, and that's going to be covering all the stuff that we've done since the first midterm. So this is going to be covering, most importantly, Immanuel Kant, but it's also going to be covering the two Thomases that we have studied, St. Thomas Aquinas and Thomas Hobbes, and then also utilitarianism. So this exam has a lot of material that we're covering. It's going to be the same format as the last exam. So what you want to do is know that it's going to have 8 questions. You're going to be asked to answer 6 of those questions, and then I will grade it based on your best 5 answers. So we're going to ask that you, like the last exam, use complete sentences, answer the question thoroughly. I mean, we should be looking at least 3 or 4 sentences for each answer, kind of to make sure that you know what is going on there. And we were going to have this exam due, I think, Monday evening. So one week from today, that'll be Monday, April 3rd, basically at midnight, 11:59 p.m. So, just like the last review, I have the exam here, and it's going to be available online soon. I'm going to go through, and I'm not going to tell you what the questions are, but in our review, we are going to be answering all of the questions so that maximizes your ability to do well on the exam. So we're not going to take these in the sequence that they're on the sheet, but we are going to cover all of them. We are going to address them, I think, more or less in the sequence that we went in the class. So the first question is going to be about St. Thomas Aquinas. And if you'll remember, he was our medieval philosopher. He's kind of the bridge between ancient and modern, although he's much closer to the modern side than he is to the ancient side. And we want to remember that Thomas Aquinas is an ethicist, an ethical thinker in the virtue tradition. So he is in the same tradition as Aristotle. He is also in the same tradition as the Stoics. So as Epictetus, whom we've read, and then there's some other Stoics. Marcus Aurelius is an important Stoic philosopher. And the genius of St. Thomas Aquinas was that he took the classical philosophical tradition and that he was able to unify that with the new religious Christian traditions, particularly with the Catholic tradition. And so this union of Catholic theology with ancient philosophy is kind of what marks the genius of St. Thomas. And Thomas gives us the natural law, and most of what we read in the selection that we read has to do with characteristics of the natural law. I'm going to talk a little bit about that here. The one thing that we want to remember that when we're talking about the natural law is that this is going to match up really well with teleology. So if you remember way back to when we were talking about Aristotle, Aristotle asked the question, and his virtue ethics is based upon the answer to the question of what is a human being for. So everything that exists in an Aristotelian scheme has a purpose. So if we'll recall, for every object that exists, there are 4 causes. The first is the material cause. It's the thing that the thing is made out of. The second is the efficient cause. It's the history of a thing. The third is the formal cause. That's the definition of a thing. And the fourth cause is the final cause. That's the purpose of a thing. That's the what it's for. And so Aquinas is going to apply this concept of teleology to the moral law, or to the natural law. And he's going to say that there is a natural moral law. And he places human virtue in this context, right? So the what a human being is for is to be virtuous, and Aristotle does this work, and it's very similar in Thomas Aquinas. But the other thing that Thomas Aquinas is going to do is he'll take moral questions also, and he will analyze them in terms of telos, in terms of final cause. And this is how he finds the natural law in the world. And so, we find things like from the Ten Commandments, right? He analyzes the world around him in teleological or purposeful terms, and he finds that those things, like in the Ten Commandments, are in fact related to the purpose of things and actions in the world. And so, for example, adultery is found to be incompatible with the purpose of human marriage, for example, or stealing is incompatible with the purpose of economy or the destination of goods. And so he is able to construct this natural law. This is not really what we read on, but this is an important thing, is that he then not only talks about virtues in the same way that Aristotle talks about virtues, but is able to also include a discussion of moral precepts. And he does it in much the same way. And that's one of the interesting things about Thomas Aquinas. He's not too different from Aristotle. What's interesting is that although Thomas Hobbes is relatively closer in time to Thomas Aquinas than Aquinas is to Aristotle, Hobbes is very different from either one of those. Thomas Hobbes, as you'll recall, is a moral positivist. He believes that any moral laws are the creations of human beings, and human beings create the moral law in order really to fulfill their own purposes. And it's to the purpose that they want. And in what we read from Hobbes, we're going to see that Hobbes is not going to find anything to be good or bad in itself, but rather it can be useful or functional for the human person or for the human society or not. And it's easy to imagine for Thomas Hobbes that over time, what is useful for a given society could change. And so the moral law for Hobbes is something that is created by human beings. It's not something that human philosophizing discovers about the natural world. This is very different from Aristotle or Aquinas, right? That they discover the natural law when they put their human science to it. Hobbes would say there's not a moral law to be discovered. There are moral laws in different societies that are created by those societies. So very different. Okay, and so this kind of covers our two Thomases. And then after we studied the two Thomases, we turned to Immanuel Kant, who was one of the major figures that we're studying in our course. We spent 2 weeks on Kant, as much time as we spent on anyone. So Kant is his project is very different than the other philosophers. And one of the things that's different about Kant is he's trying to put moral philosophy on an a priori foundation. And so we need to talk a little bit about that distinction between a priori and a posteriori. In our text, I don't think that the term a posteriori is used, but that would be the complementary term. And these things refer to knowledge that is prior to experience or knowledge that is posterior or after experience. So it's knowledge that's prior to experience or knowledge that's after experience. And we need to remember that when we talk about before or after or prior or after, we're not talking about kind of the temporality of when the knowledge was gained or the, the time that it was gained, but we're talking about whether a given piece of knowledge is true independently of our experience, right? Whether it would be true regardless of what we experience in the world, or if it is very much dependent upon our experience. And so in the modern world, we're really used to thinking about science and especially empiricism, where we apply the scientific method and we observe phenomena in the world and then we speculate and reason about them. Everything that's brought to us through the scientific method or through the empirical method would be an a posteriori knowledge. It's based upon our experience. Our experience is the critical component of knowing those things. Right? And they can be really basic things. You know, a good example of a posteriori knowledge is that I have knowledge that the sun is going to rise tomorrow. I know that it will come up. I don't know the time exactly. I think it's probably going to be sometime between, right around 7:30, something like that. But I have knowledge because of my experience in the world. Every other day of my life, the sun has risen, and I'm using that experience, and the fact that from day to day the sunrise time doesn't change very much. I watched part of the sunrise today, and I think that I was seeing the sun come above the horizon it was about a quarter to 8, and so I would anticipate that the sun will rise at a somewhat similar time tomorrow, probably a little bit earlier because we are now after the spring equinox and the days are still getting longer. That's a posteriori knowledge. It's a good way to know things. It's not the only way to know things. The other way that we know things is a priori knowledge. And these are things that are true regardless of our experiences of the world. So regardless of whatever we think, not regardless of whatever we think, should not have said that. Regardless of whatever we experience in the world, some things are always true. And the good example of this is mathematics, or arithmetic especially. So we know that 2 and 3 are 5, and that 2 and 3 are always 5. And so, for example, if we encounter a time in the world where it looks like 2 and 3 are not 5, then we know that there's something that's faulty about our experience. And you might be thinking, well, what are you talking about? Well, a lot of us have had jobs as cashiers at one time or another. And one of the things that you do when you're a cashier is at the end of your shift, or it might be in the middle of your shift, you're going to go through and you're going to reconcile your drawer. You're going to use mathematics to check the arithmetic to make sure that you did your job right? To make sure that your experience of conducting financial transactions matched up to what we know a priori of how those transactions should have gone. That's why we check our drawer. That's why we reconcile our drawer, because we have some knowledge that is gained a priori, and that knowledge is going to be true independent of our experience. And if our experience is different than that knowledge, then our drawer will either be long or short some amount of money. And if it is, we know that our experience was faulty, not that the knowledge was faulty, because the knowledge we know regardless of our experience. And so Kant wanted to place moral reasoning on this same foundation, on the foundation of a priori reasoning. And why did he want to do this? Well, he was writing in the 18th century. This is the age of enlightenment. He's an Enlightenment thinker. But the reason why the Enlightenment existed in the first place is because it came after a bunch of religious wars. It came after a time where people were having a hard time agreeing with one another about what's true and what's false, and moral principles were an important part of that. And Kant wanted to develop a philosophy of morals that everybody would agree with, that everybody could consent to, that you're not going to find different answers. And that's why he wanted moral knowledge to be a priority, because then it's certain. It doesn't matter what your experience is. The moral knowledge is certain. If you are acting in accordance with a priori moral reasoning, you know that you have done rightly. If you're dependent upon experience, well, sometimes our experiences can be wrong. Sometimes our experiences are mistaken. And sometimes our experiences are deceptive. So if we want to remember back a couple of months when it was close to Christmas time, a lot of us would have watched A Christmas Carol. If you haven't, I really recommend that you read the book by Dickens. It's very short, especially for a Dickens book. And we see that Scrooge in there understands that his senses can be deceived. And he talks about this to the ghost of Jacob Marley. He says to Jacob Marley, how do I know that you're there? The senses are so easily deceived. You could be indigestion. You could be, he says, you could be a bit of underdone potato, a blot of mustard, or a spot of beef. There's more of gravy than of grave about you. So this idea that our senses can be deceived or mistaken is an old one, and it's one that we're familiar with. And this was the problem that Kant was trying to solve. Okay? So Kant thought that reasoning needed to be a priori, and what he did was he decided to use reason itself to examine the concept of the moral law itself. And what he found, when he used reason itself, independent of experience, to examine the moral law itself, was that the content of the moral law is that it is universal. That on an a priori basis, we know that the law of itself is universal. Right? And so this led him to formulate what he called the categorical imperative. So the categorical imperative is two things. First of all, it's categorical, which means that it's true across all categories. Then I know that's like not a great definition, but it means that it's true in all circumstances. Something that's categorically true is something that's true regardless of what the world of experience is telling us. Right? So it's categorical, and the second thing that we know is that it's imperative, which means it's something that you must abide by. So the categorical imperative is act always such that you can will that your maxim, which is the principle of action, you can will that your maxim is also a universal moral law. Right? And so this is a moral imperative, a categorical moral imperative that is not dependent upon experience. It's true because of the law itself. And then he gave the famous examples that we've talked about. So the categorical imperative is true regardless of experience, and it serves as a guide to action. Because what we can ask when confronted with a moral question is, can my maxim, the principle of action, remember, can my maxim also be willed to be a universal law? Can I will to universalize my maxim? Is it true for everyone? And Kant is going to say that this is the nature of moral questions. Okay? And then, if you remember, that was the first formulation, and then there were a couple of other formulations of the categorical imperative. Right? So what we had was the principle of the universalization of the moral law taught us or told us or implied reasonably something that was also true about the moral actor, right? And this has to do with the good itself also. That if the moral actor is the one who is being addressed in the universal law, then he has his own end. You cannot subordinate that moral actor to another end. Okay? What does that mean? It means that the person who is capable of the good, the person who is capable of the good, so that's you and me and everyone we know, right? They're all capable of the good. They're capable of formulating the categorical imperative, right? That they have an absolute worth. They have an absolute worth. And this is a fundamental equality of all people, right? Kant is the first person really to give a rational defense of the fundamental equality of all persons. Right? It's a newer idea than we're aware. Aristotle, as much as I value his virtue ethics, did not believe in human equality. He believed that there are higher types of humans and lower types of humans, and what was right for one person was not necessarily what was right for another person. He believed that some people were naturally slaves and other people were naturally masters. And there's nothing in his philosophy that is going to contradict that. There is something in Kant, right? Kant believes in the absolute worth of every individual human being, which means that you cannot subordinate them to your good. Right? You cannot subordinate them to your good. Now, that means you can never use them as a means to your own end only. Can you use them partially as a means to your end? Yes. You can hire somebody to do a job, right? That's nothing problematic about that. But you have to treat them a certain way when you hire them. First of all, you don't get to enslave them. Then you have to pay them a fair wage. Then you're not allowed to ask them to do something that's undignified, right? They remain in some important ways very much in control. So this is the second formulation then of the categorical imperative. Act always such that either in yourself or in another person, that you never treat someone as a means only, but also as an end in themselves. Right? This means that it applies not just to the other person, it applies back to you. You can't treat yourself as a means only. You can't do things that are beneath your own dignity, even if those are things that give you pleasure. Right? You can't wallow in the mud, so to speak. Right? It would be beneath, it fails to treat you as an end in yourself. And so there are moral evils that go along with this that we used to think more of as problematic that we might not think of as problematic today. Things like gluttony and things like we're eating to excess or causing yourself a disease in the pursuit of pleasure. That's not allowed in Kant because you're failing to treat yourself as an end in yourself. This also applies to every other human being. You're not allowed to enslave people. You have to treat people well. Okay, and this brings us to the third formulation of the categorical imperative, which has to do with each person legislating the moral law. Each person legislating